There are stories that lie dormant for decades, buried under layers of time and forgotten memories. They are the stories of the unnamed, the lost, their final months shrouded in mystery. This is one of those stories. It begins in the spring of 1968, a turbulent year in American history. But in the rolling hills of Georgetown, Kentucky, a discovery would create a sad testament to a life cut short. It is the story of a young woman who would come to be known only as Tent Girl, and the unlikely obsession of a man who refused to let her be forgotten. If you want to hear more true crime stories, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. To understand the shock of the discovery, you must first understand the place. Scott County, Kentucky, in the spring of it was a land of rolling bluegrass hills where ancient stone fences crisscrossed endless fields of grazing thoroughbreds. The air itself felt different, thick, with the sweet, earthy scent of damp soil, blossoming dogwood, and the faint, ever-present aroma of horses and hay. The town of Georgetown, the county seat, was the kind of... Its main street was lined with proud brick buildings from the 19th century, housing family-owned hardware stores, a single-screen movie theater, and a diner where the coffee was always on and the waitresses knew your order by heart. Life was governed by the rhythms of the seasons, the church bells on Sunday, and the Friday night football games that brought the entire community together under the glow of the stadium lights. This was a world away. 1968 was a year the country seemed to be tearing itself apart. The Tet Offensive in Vietnam had shattered any illusion of quick victory. In April, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had sent plumes of smoke rising from dozens of American cities. Protests, riots, and a yawning generation gap were the dominant headlines. But in Scott County, here, the concerns were more immediate, more tangible. The price of tobacco, the chances of a late frost, the health of a newborn foal. It was a community that felt insulated, protected by its geography and its deeply held traditional values. There was a belief, spoken or unspoken, that the horrors seen on the Walter Cronkite broadcast simply didn't happen here. That was a big city problem, a coastal. This deep-seated sense of peace, of safety, is what made the discovery on May 17th so profoundly terrifying. It was a violation not just of the law, but of the unspoken promise of tranquility that defined the town's very identity. The evil of the outside world, it seemed, had finally found its way down their quiet country roads. On that May 17th, a local man named Wilbur Riddle was out scavenging for glass. He was a man who knew the land, its contours, and its secrets. The hum of the sparse traffic on the highway was a familiar soundtrack to his solitary hobby. The air was warm, the sun filtering through the dense canopy of new spring leaves, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor. He moved with a practiced ease, his eyes scanning the ground, his mind, but something down the embankment, a shape and color that didn't belong to nature, snagged his attention. It was a splash of dark, military green against the vibrant life of the woods. A canvas tarpaulin, the kind used for tents or to cover machinery, was bundled and partially hidden by undergrowth. It wasn't just discarded trash. It looked deliberately placed. Curiosity mingled with a scavenger's hope. He slid down the dusty embankment, his boots dislodging small stones. He nudged the bundle with foot. It didn't give. It was dense, heavy, and strangely solid. He pushed again, harder this time. It rolled slightly, and the shape, obscured by folds of thick canvas, became horribly, undeniably clear. It was the shape of a human body, wrapped tight, a macabre gift left on the doorstep of the cheerful singing of the birds in the trees above, transformed into a shrill, mocking chorus. The sweet smell of honeysuckle that had perfumed the air was suddenly cloying, suffocating, replaced by the metallic tang of pure, primal fear. He scrambled back up the embankment, his heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against his ribs. His breath, every ghost story he had ever heard, every whispered tale of things best left undisturbed, flooded his mind. But this was real. This was here. He ran, not daring to look back, his feet finding their way to a nearby gas station. His voice had choked. Desperate gasp as he told the attendant to call the sheriff. Sheriff Bobby Vance arrived at the scene within minutes. The flashing red and blue lights of his patrol car seeming. Vance was a man who embodied the stoicism of his community. He was accustomed to settling neighborly disputes, investigating the occasional break-in, and keeping the peace in a county where most people knew each other's business. He had only dealt with 2 murders in his 11 years as sheriff, both crimes of passion, messy, quickly solved. The why, but as he stood on the shoulder of Route 25, looking down at the grim bundle his deputies were now approaching, a cold premonition settled in his heart. This different. This felt anonymous, calculated. His deputies carefully cut away the thick, stiff canvas utility knives. The air grew heavy, thick with the odor of decay that signaled a life long since ended. The scene that emerged was the young woman inside was in a state of advanced decomposition, her features cruelly erased by the relentless work of time and nature. She was small, with long, reddish-brown hair matted around her head. Her hands, which still showed the faint traces of carefully applied nail polish, a ghostly pink, were frozen in a posture that spoke of a final, desperate struggle to claw her way out of her canvas tomb. The initial examination by the coroner at the scene, the cause of death was believed to be asphyxiation, but there were also signs of a brutal beating. Her age was estimated to be somewhere between 16 and 21. She had a distinctive gap between her 2 front teeth, one small, unique detail in the vast, crushing emptiness of her identity. This wasn't a person anymore. It was a collection of facts, a grim puzzle. Days later, in the sterile, quiet environment of the county morgue, the full, grim reality of the task ahead became clear. The coroner, Dr. Aldred, a man who had seen his share of tragedy, worked under the harsh glare of an overhead lamp. The forensic science of 1968 was a world away from what it would become. There was no DNA testing, no national computer identification relied on the basics, dental records, personal effects, and the hope that someone, somewhere, was looking for this specific person. And this person, almost nothing. Her clothing was common, a simple blouse and slacks, with no labels that could trace them to a specific store or region. The only jewelry she wore was a cheap, gold-plated ring with a small, indistinct stone, the kind that could have been bought at any 5 and Aldred meticulously documented every detail. He noted the contusions on her torso, the evidence of the brutal struggle that preceded her death. He charted her teeth, paying special attention to the diastema, the gap between her incisors. That, he thought, might be their best chance. A dentist would remember a feature like that. He took her fingerprints, rolling each. Unless she had a criminal record or had served in the military, those prints would likely lead nowhere. Every step of the process was a meticulous exercise in diminishing hope. The final report was a collection of cold, hard data that painted a picture of a violent end, but offered no clue as to the life that had been extinguished. For Sheriff Vance, reading that report was like looking at a map with no names. He had a victim. He was hunting a killer without knowing who had been killed. The weeks that followed bled into frustrating summer. The file on Sheriff Vance's desk grew thicker with teletypes, dead-end leads, and the transcribed accounts of fruitless interviews, but no closer to giving the victim her name. The fluorescent lights of his small office hummed deep into the humid Kentucky nights. He would sit there long after his deputies had gone home to their families, the silence broken only by the rhythmic chirp of crickets outside his window and the occasional crackle of the police radio. On the wall behind him, a corkboard became a monument to their. It held the few pathetic clues: an 8x10 glossy photograph of the green tarp, a grainy, black and white shot of the makeshift gravesite, and the dental chart, a clinical drawing of a smile that no one had forward to claim. He'd find himself staring at that chart, trying to pull a memory into existence, trying to picture the face that went with it. He'd pick up the coroner's report for the 100th time, his finger. Female, Caucasian, estimated age 16 to 21, 5'1", 110 pounds, reddish-brown hair. It was a description of a ghost. His deputy, a fresh-faced kid named Miller, would sometimes find him there, staring at the board. "Anything new, Sheriff?" Miller would ask, his voice hesitant. Vance would just shake his head, the smoke from his cigarette curling up towards the ceiling. "Nothing that makes a damn bit of sense, son. It's like she fell from the moon. Not in Kentucky, not in Ohio, not anywhere we've checked. How does a person just ... cease to exist?" He would lean back in his creaky office chair, the smell of stale coffee and cigarette smoke filling his nostrils, and feel the crushing weight of professional failure. He was the sheriff. It was his job to protect these people, to find answers, to keep the unspoken horrors at bay. But in the case of the girl on the side of the road was more than a case filed to him. She was a promise he was failing to keep, a silent resident of his county that he couldn't even name. She was a symbol of the evil that had trespassed in his wide world, and he, the guardian at the gate, was powerless to stop or even give it a name. This ghost, this collection of facts on a coroner, and she had a name. Barbara Ann Hackman, Bobby, those who loved her. Months before her body was discovered, in the late autumn of 1967, Barbara was living in a small, cramped house in Lexington. Her world had shrunk, becoming a cycle of caring for her infant daughter and waiting for her husband, George Earl Taylor, to return from whatever carnival or odd job he was working. He was a man who lived on the road, and one afternoon, with the baby sleeping soundly in her crib and the golden autumn light streaming through the window, Barbara sat down to write a letter to her family back in Arkansas. The pen felt good in her hand, a tangible connection to the people she missed so dearly. She wrote about the baby's first smile, about the funny way she gurgled when she was happy. She described the changing colors of the leaves in Kentucky, so different, but underneath the cheerful updates, there was a current of unease. She wrote about George's moods, his unpredictable temper, the way he would disappear for days at a time. She wrote about her loneliness, about her dream of saving enough money to come home for a long visit, maybe even for good. She folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope. It was a message of love, but it was also a message in a bottle, a subtle cry for help from a life that was slowly drifting off course. She had no way of knowing it would be the last letter she'd ever write, the last time her family would ever hear from her. In Benton, Arkansas, that last letter was read and reread, treasured for the connection it provided. But then the silence began. Christmas approached, and there was still no word, no card, no wall. A knot of worry, cold and tight, began to form in the chests of the Hackman family. Rosemary Westbrook, Bobby's sister, finally decided she couldn't wait any longer. She found the number for the house in Lexington and dialed, her hand trembling slightly. The phone rang, a hollow sound echoing over the 100 miles of telephone wire. It rang and rang. Finally, a man's voice answered, abrupt and impatient. It was George. His tone was flat, devoid of warmth or concern. "She's not here," he said, before Rosemary could even finish explaining who she was. Rosemary's heart hammered against her ribs. A cold dread washed over her. "What do you mean she's not there, George? Where is she? Is the baby okay?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "She left," he said, the words clipped and cold, utterly devoid of emotion. "Packed her bags and left a few weeks ago. Took off with some other fella." The explanation was like a physical blow. It made no sense. It was a betrayal of everything he knew about their sister. Bobby lived for her daughter. She was a devoted, loving mother who had endured a difficult marriage precisely because she refused to abandon her child. "That doesn't sound like Bobby. That is not the sister I know." His voice grew sharp then, laced with a defensive anger that was more terrifying than grief. "Oh, that's what happened. Pete changed. She's gone." The conversation was a dead end, a cold, hard wall of indifference. In the weeks and months that followed, the family tried again and again, but the story never wavered. They went to the police, but with no evidence of foul play, and the husband insisting his wife had simply left. There was nothing to be done. It was one person's word against another gut feeling. They were left with a chilling void, and a story they knew in their bones was a lie. They were forced to live with this version of events, a version that cruelly painted their beloved sister as a flighty, irresponsible woman. They knew the Bobby who was kind and loving, the Bobby whose world revolved around her child. And they knew, with a certainty that would become the defining pain of their lives for the next 30 years, that something terrible had happened to her. As the investigation in Scott County stalled and went cold, the press gave the unidentified woman a name. It was a name born of the object that had been her shroud, a name that would be etched onto her tombstone when, in 1971, the committee laid her to rest in the Georgetown Cemetery. The stone, paid for by a local monument company, was a stark and lonely monument to a forgotten life. Tent Girl, found May 17, 1968, on U.S. Highway 25, and died about April 26, May 3, 1968, age about 1619 years. For years, she lay there under that name, a silent enigma. Her story transformed. It became a local legend, a ghost story whispered at sleepovers and around campfires. She was the ghost of 25, a cautionary tale parents told their teenage daughters of the dangers of talking to strangers. The real woman, with her reddish, the world moved on. But for Wilbur Riddle, the man who found her, the memory of that day remained as vivid and horrifying as if it had happened yesterday. It was a story he would tell his own children, a ghost story that was all too real. And it was a story that would, in time, find its way to a young man who would make it his mission to unravel the 30-year-old mystery of the Tent Girl. The story of the Tent Girl was one such tale in the Riddle family, a dark inheritance passed from father to daughter, and eventually was son-in-law. In the late 1980s, Todd Matthews, a factory worker from Tennessee, married into the Riddle family. He was a quiet, unassuming man with a steady, curious mind. He first heard the story on a Halloween night, a fitting time for a tale of the unnamed dead. It was a real-life puzzle that snagged at the edges of his thoughts, a profound injustice that had unfolded just down the road from his new family. The thought of this young woman, buried under a name was not her own. Her family, somewhere out in the vastness of the world, oblivious to her fate, took root in his imagination and grew into a quiet, relentless obsession. For the next 10 years, by day, he worked at an auto parts factory, his hands busy with the repetitive, tangible tasks of the present. But by night, and in every spare moment, he was a detective, his mind immersed in the past. He began his search in the most analog of ways. He spent countless hours in the local library, hunched over a noisy, blinking microfilm reader. The machine would whir and click as he scrolled through reels of old newspapers. The fuzzy, blackened, he was looking for any mention of the discovery, any small detail that might have been overlooked. The strain on his eyes was immense, but it was nothing compared to the strain of constant disappointment. He made phone calls, wrote letters to law enforcement agencies, and chased down leads that more often than not led to dead ends. He spent his own money on long-distance charges and copying fees, driven by a need he couldn't fully articulate. She was supportive, but she worried. She saw the toll the lonely quest was taking him. But for Todd, it was a matter of fundamental justice, of restoring a name to a life, of giving a family the peace of knowing. The late 1990s brought with it a new tool, a revolution in communication, information sharing, the internet. For Todd, it was like a light being switched on in a vast, dark room. He discovered a burgeoning online community of amateur sleuths, people just like him, who were dedicated to solving the mysteries of the unidentified. He learned to build a website, a skill born of pure necessity. He called it tentgirl.com, a digital monument to the woman in the Georgetown Cemetery. He painstakingly uploaded all the information he had gathered, her physical description, the details of her discovery, the coroner. It was a digital message in a bottle, cast into the great, expanding ocean of the World Wide Web, in the hope that someone, somewhere, would see it and recognize a piece of their own missing story. Meanwhile, Rosemary Westbrook's message in a bottle had finally been found. Todd Matthews' email connected 30 years of mystery in a single electrifying moment. The case of the tent girl was no longer armed with the name Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor and a prime suspect. The Scott County Sheriff's Office, a new generation of investigators carrying the torch from Sheriff Vance, officially reopened the case. Their first challenge was formidable. Their main suspect, George Earl Taylor, had died of cancer in 1987. A confession was impossible. They would have to build a case against a ghost, proving his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt to finally give Barbara's family the answers they deserved. They started by trying to reconstruct the last few months of Barbara's life, and that meant diving into the transient, closed-off world of carnival workers. They tracked down a man who had worked the circus with George for years, now living in a cramped, sweltering trailer. Two modern detectives sat across from an old carny whose memories were as vivid as the tattoos on his arms. "Tell us about George," one of the detectives began, his voice calm. "What was he like back then?" The old man squinted, looking past them, through the decades. "George? He was a quiet fella, kept himself, but had a temper on him. Mean streak, you know, like a snake, especially when he was drinking." The detectives exchanged a look. "Did you know his wife, Bob?" The man nodded slowly, a flicker of sadness in his eyes. "Yeah, I remember her. Sweet girl. Too good for him. Real pretty. Doted on that little baby of hers. Then one day she was just gone." The detective paused, letting the silence hang in the humid air. "What did George tell you happened?" The old man let out a dry, cynical laugh. "He fed us. We all knew that was a load of bull. A woman like that doesn't just up and leave her kid. We figured he'd done something to her. But back then, you didn't ask questions. You kept your head down, you did your job, and you moved on to next town. It wasn't our business." The detectives continued their search, digging into George's family history. They found she described George as a controlling and jealous husband, prone to fits of rage. She recounted how he had shown up at a family gathering in early 1968, alone with baby. When asked where Bobby was, he had coldly repeated the story that she had run off. The family, she admitted, had their suspicions, but in an era where family matters were kept private, no one. Slowly, piece by piece, a portrait of the killer emerged. A man of quiet menace and explosive violence. A man who had lied with chilling ease for 2 decades. Confident his secret was buried forever in a lonely grave in Kentucky. The air at the Georgetown Cemetery was heavy with a mixture of anticipation and solemnity on the day of the exhumation. For the investigators, it was the culmination of a 30-year-old case that had suddenly and miraculously. For Todd Matthews, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, it was the moment of truth, the culmination of a decade of relentless, lonely pursuit. And for Rosemary Westbrook and her family, who had traveled from Arkansas, it was a moment of profound and painful hope. As the earth was carefully removed, and the casket that had held the tent girl for nearly 3 decades was brought to the surface, a hush fell over the remains were carefully transported to the state medical examiner's office in Frankfurt. The science of identification had advanced light years since 1968. Now, the DNA. Scientists extracted a sample from the pulp of one of the girl's teeth. They took a saliva sample from Rosemary. The 2 samples were sent to a lab for comparison, and the wait for the results was agonizing. Finally, the call came. The results were unequivocal. On April 26, 1998, the Scott County Sheriff's Office held a press conference to make the official announcement. The tent girl had a name. She was Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor. The mystery that had haunted a small Kentucky town for 3 decades was finally solved. The news brought a complex wave of emotions for Barbara's family. There was the profound, soul-deep grief of finally knowing the terrible. There was the white-hot anger at the years not knowing, of the life that had been stolen from her and the lies they had been forced to endure. Beneath it all, there was a quiet, fragile sense of peace, of closure, of finally being able to bring their Bobby home, not in person, but in name and in memory. A few weeks later, the family gathered again at the Georgetown Cemetery. The sky was brilliant, cloudless Kentucky blue. This was a second funeral, a chance to say the goodbye they had been so cruelly denied for 30 years. They stood before the grave, the old, weathered tent girl's stone, now a relic of a painful, anonymous past. A new granite stone was ready to be placed, one that bore her real name. Rosemary stepped forward, a single white rose clutched in her hand. She looked at the faces of she thought back to her sister, making a conscious effort to push away the image of the victim and remember the vibrant, laughing young woman she had been. She remembered Bobby's kindness, her infectious giggle, her fierce, unwavering love for her family, and most of all, her absolute devotion to her daughter. The grief was immense, a physical ache in her chest. But for the first time in 3 decades, it was a grief that had a focal point, a name. She knelt and placed the rose on the fresh earth, her tears falling freely onto the soil that had held her sister's secret for so long. There were no easy answers to the questions that still lingered. Justice for their sister would never be served in a courtroom. But here, in this quiet cemetery, under the warm Kentucky sun, they could finally give her what she had been denied for so long. A name, a memory. They were no longer mourning a ghost. They were honoring a sister, a mother, daughter. In the spring of 1998, that new headstone was placed at the grave. It read, Barbara Ann Hackman, Bobby, September 12, 1943, 1967. Loving mother, grandmother, and sister. The family made a conscious decision to leave her married name off the stone, a final, silent testament to the man they believed was responsible for her death. The story of the tent girl is more. It is a story about the enduring power of family love. It is a story about the dawn of a new age of investigation, where the power of the internet could connect the dots of a decades-old mystery. And it is a story about the extraordinary dedication of one ordinary man. Todd Matthews' work on this case was a spark that would ignite He realized that there were thousands of tent girls out there, thousands of unidentified bodies in morgues and lonely graves, and thousands of families like the Hackmans, trapped in the torment of not knowing. He saw how the internet, the same tool that had brought him to Rosemary Westbrook, could be harnessed on a massive scale to help them. Along with another online sleuth he had met during his quest, it was a volunteer organization, a digital headquarters for the lost. They created a vast, open-source database, a place where information on unidentified victims Jane and John Does could be cross-referenced with missing persons reports from across the country. It was a painstaking, often heartbreaking. Volunteers, ordinary people from all walks of life, would spend their free time poring over cold case files, searching for the smallest detail, a piece of jewelry, a unique tattoo, a surgical scar, a dental anomaly that could connect an unnamed person to a family desperate search. The Doe Network became a bridge between the forgotten and the grieving, a testament to the power. Its legacy is written in the hundreds of cases it has helped to solve, giving names back to the nameless and bringing a measure of peace to families who lost all hope. The legacy of Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor is not just one of tragedy, but of transformation. Her case became a catalyst, proving that no case is ever truly cold, and that sometimes the most powerful force for justice isn't a badge or a gun, but a citizen with a computer